The Baltic Sea was unnervingly silent on that April dawn of 1941. But beneath its calm, glass-like surface, Nazi Germany was preparing one of the boldest and most dangerous naval maneuvers of the entire war. The battleship Bismarck rested at anchor, immense and motionless like a beast in hibernation. Almost no one outside the upper ranks knew where it would go next, and that secrecy was intentional. The world believed the Bismarck had been created to destroy the Royal Navy in direct, decisive combat, but that was never its true purpose. Its real mission was far more subtle, far more strategic, and far more perilous. Hitler, obsessed with surprising Britain, approved a daring plan to send the largest battleship ever built by Germany into the North Atlantic to sever Britain's lifeline of imported supplies. To many Germans, using such a colossal war machine to attack merchant convoys seemed like a waste of its firepower, but not to the German Naval Command. They understood a crucial fact: Britain lived on imports. Fuel, food, weapons, everything arrived by sea. Disrupt that flow, and the island nation would slowly suffocate. And this was exactly what the Bismarck had been designed for, not to duel British battleships, but to hunt supply convoys. Within the corridors of the High Command, the operation received a deliberately vague name: Rheinübung, Rhine exercise. The title was chosen to mislead spies and even members of the regime not privy to the true goal. In reality, the stakes were nothing less than an attempt to strike at the economic heart of the British Empire. The mission was simple on paper and nearly impossible in execution. The Bismarck would depart from the Baltic Sea under a shroud of secrecy. Behind it followed the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, faster and equipped with more modern sensors. Together, they would slip through the North Sea and into the Atlantic via the notorious Denmark Strait, a corridor patrolled by ice, storms, and above all, the Royal Navy. If they passed through undetected, the Atlantic would open before them like a vast hunting ground. There, their task was to strike British convoys, sinking cargo ships, disrupting supply lines, and spreading chaos. But there was one devastating detail. The Bismarck would have no air cover, no fast escorts, no friendly base to retreat to. If discovered, it would be utterly alone. As preparations advanced, Germany's naval officers argued fiercely with Hitler. They knew the risks. They knew the Bismarck was too valuable to gamble so recklessly. They insisted it should be used as a deterrent, an immovable shadow, forcing Britain to keep its fleet near home.
But Hitler had no patience for caution. He demanded results, demanded psychological impact, demanded headlines. To him, the Bismarck needed to terrify Britain, and quickly. So, against the judgment of Germany's sharpest strategists, the mission was approved. In the days leading up to departure, the crew lived in a state of tension, blended with pride. Technicians tuned engines and calibrated turret mechanisms. Sailors scrubbed the deck and reviewed emergency protocols. Engineers inspected every line and weld of the hull. Everyone sensed they were about to take part in something historic. But not all shared the same anticipation. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commander of the expedition, carried a quiet pessimism. He knew the Bismarck's strengths, but he also knew its limits. As powerful as it was, it could not fight the entire Royal Navy alone, and he feared, deeply, that the mission was being launched too late with too little support. Still, he would carry out his duty. When the Bismarck finally left port in the early hours of the morning, only a handful of eyes witnessed its silent departure. The sky was overcast. The water was calm. The battleship gliding into the darkness beside the Prinz Eugen felt less like the beginning of a mission and more like a forewarning. No guns fired, no enemy knew their destination, no confrontation had begun yet. But the operation was now in motion, and with it, Germany had just released into the Atlantic one of the most dangerous war machines ever built, and at the same time, one of the most vulnerable. From that moment on, every wave, every radar signal, every distant shadow on the horizon could mark the beginning of a chase that would reshape the course of the war, and the world had no idea what was coming.
The Bismarck cut through the Atlantic like a silent colossus, slicing the waves with a dark elegance. The strong wind whistled through the steel structures, and the cold mist wrapped around the ship like a shroud. With every passing hour, the crew sensed something shifting in the air, as if the ocean itself were warning them of what was coming. Despite the disciplined routine on board, no one was fooled by the apparent calm. Everyone knew the enemy could appear on the horizon at any moment. Captain Ernst Lindemann walked across the bridge with steady steps, studying the gray surface of the sea. He trusted the ship's power, but he also knew the Atlantic was merciless. Admiral Lidgens remained expressionless as he reviewed maps and possible routes. The operation was still underway, but British presence in the Atlantic was almost inevitable. Tension built up silently, like electricity in the air before a storm. In the early afternoon, the distant sound of an engine tore through the monotony of the wind. A lookout raised his binoculars, eyes narrowed against the pale sunlight filtering through heavy clouds. The warning echoed through the mast like thunder. An enemy aircraft was approaching. It was a British Catalina, flying high, but close enough to observe the Bismarck clearly. The crew rushed to their stations, but it was too late to prevent the sighting. The plane completed its turn and vanished into the fog, but everyone knew that the ship's position was now in British hands. The news spread through the Bismarck like an anxious whisper. Some sighed heavily. Others clenched their jaws in silence. Lindemann inhaled deeply, aware that they had just entered a new phase of the operation. Lidgens, his expression rigid, ordered the ship to maintain its course with absolute discipline. Time was now working against them. On the other side of the ocean, the Catalina's message hit London like an electric shock. The Bismarck had been found. The warship designed to terrorize the seas, the threat Britain had feared for years, was now loose in the Atlantic. Shock quickly turned to frantic action. Destroying the battleship became the highest priority. Ships were redirected at once. Emergency signals were transmitted. The entire Royal Navy seemed to awaken in a single blow.
The Hood and the Prince of Wales received immediate orders: intercept the Bismarck. Other vessels reorganized into hunting groups. The carrier Ark Royal prepared to launch its attack squadrons. For the first time in the war, a single German ship forced nearly the entire Royal Navy into motion. The swarm of British forces advancing across the ocean made one thing clear: the Bismarck would not face isolated enemies. It would face an entire nation. Meanwhile, the ocean around the Bismarck seemed to shrink. Night fell with suffocating darkness, and the crew extinguished all external lights to reduce the risk of detection. The ship moved like a shadow, yet the white trail of foam left behind glowed faintly under the moonlight, an involuntary mark betraying its position to any radar or watchful eye. Inside the Bismarck, every sound gained meaning: the hiss of radios, the distant creak of beams, the steady rumble of the engines. Sailors walked silently through narrow corridors, some trying to stay calm, others consumed by unease. They knew the encounter with the British was not a possibility, it was a certainty, and it was coming faster than anyone expected. During the early hours of the morning, the cruiser HMS Suffolk
picked up a clear radar echo. Something enormous was moving in the expected direction. Confirmation soon followed. 2 German ships were sailing through the darkness, Bismarck and Prince Eugene. At the same time, German operators detected strange signals in the environment, unusual radio waves, faint echoes in the dark. It was as if the ocean were beginning to reveal that they were no longer alone. The alert swept through the Bismarck within seconds. Men ran to their stations. The engines roared at full power. The massive 380mm gun turrets began to turn slowly, like dormant monsters stirring awake. The entire ship vibrated with a primal energy, a mixture of determination and human tension. On the horizon, shadows began to emerge, dark points against the thin line between sea and sky. The British Prince of the Seas, the HMS Hood, was approaching. Beside it, the modern Prince of Wales surged forward with decisive speed. The Bismarck and its enemies were finally on the same stage. The ocean, indifferent and monumental, braced itself for the most dramatic naval battle of the modern era. The German crew inhaled deeply. On the other side, the British did the same. The distance shrank. The wind howled as if announcing the inevitable. And the moment that would change the course of the war was about to begin.
The silence that preceded the battle felt impossible for a moment. So heavy. It was the kind of silence that exists only when 2 colossal forces observe each other from a distance, like legendary beasts on the verge of collision. The sea seemed to breathe deeply. The wind blew in sharp gusts that pushed the fog around, revealing and hiding the silhouettes of the enemy ships in intervals of mere seconds. Every sailor on every vessel felt the weight of history pressing down on them. The Bismarck held its course, steady and cold, while the Hood approached with the conviction of a ship that carried decades of prestige as the supreme pride of the Royal Navy. On the Prince of Wales, the crew was still struggling to adjust to combat rhythm. The ship had been commissioned hastily with several systems incomplete. But British morale was fierce. They were not there merely to intercept a German battleship, they were there to protect the honor of the British Navy itself. On Hood's Bridge, sailors watched the German giant with a mixture of anxiety and confidence. The legendary battlecruiser had taken part in operations around the world and was regarded almost as a sacred entity by the British public. Yet many officers knew of its vulnerabilities, especially the thin deck armor, dangerously weak against plunging projectiles fired from the Bismarck. There was an unspoken truth among the crew. The Hood was mighty, but not invulnerable. Aboard the Bismarck, Lindman carefully monitored the enemy's approach. His voice remained calm, but his eyes betrayed absolute tension. The presence of the Hood carried a psychological impact that was impossible to ignore. It was facing a symbol. Lutgens, meanwhile, stood rigid, focused purely on strategy. He knew the coming battle would be brutally intense and that the slightest mistake could be fatal. Ahead of them, the Prince Eugen maintained its disciplined course, adjusting slightly to stay aligned. When the ships finally entered firing range, the calm shattered with a sharp British order. The Hood fired first. Its guns shook the entire ship, and the initial salvo tore through the sky with overwhelming force. The Prince of Wales followed, though its new and untested systems struggled, causing frequent misfires. The sound of the British bombardment rolled across the Atlantic like metallic thunder. The Bismarck responded seconds later. Its massive 380mm turrets rotated with mechanical precision, and the blast reverberated through the entire ship. Waves burst outward from the hull. Thick white smoke rose in towers, and the recoil made every steel plate vibrate. The German battleship had officially entered the fight, and it had done so with everything it had. The exchange of fire escalated rapidly. Great columns of water rose around the ships, some towering as high as buildings. Each impact against the sea sent shockwaves through the hulls. The Hood advanced aggressively, closing the distance in an attempt to reduce the Germans' accuracy, but this maneuver placed it at the exact angle most dangerous for its vulnerable ammunition magazines.
Inside the Bismarck, the rhythm of battle was suffocating. With every shot, the deck vibrated as if the ship were made of muscle and bone. Gunners adjusted their aim with superhuman speed. Officers shouted coordinates. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of engine oil running hot at full power. The tension was so immense that some sailors barely noticed they were holding their breath for long seconds at a time, releasing it in nervous bursts every time an enemy shell landed too close. Then, suddenly, a violent impact shook the Bismarck. A shell from the Prince of Wales had struck the bow, causing significant damage. Alarms echoed through the corridors. Damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding. Water surged into the forward compartments. Oil fumes spread through the air. The crew fought desperately to keep the ship stable. The truth was undeniable. The German Titan, for all its strength, was not indestructible. But the shot that would change the course of the battle did not come from the Prince of Wales. It came from the Bismarck itself. Its third salvo found the Hood with terrifying precision. One of its shells plunged exactly where it shouldn't have, into the critical area leading to the ship's ammunition magazines. For an instant, there was only silence, a crushing, unnatural silence. The next moment, the ocean erupted. A colossal explosion tore the Hood apart. Fire shot upward like a volcanic eruption in the middle of the sea. The blast was so immense, so catastrophic, that it split the battlecruiser in two. In barely 3 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy was gone. British sailors watched in horror as their most beloved ship vanished before their eyes. The shock rippled through the Prince of Wales. Some men froze, others screamed. The emotional impact was as devastating as the physical one. Nearly 1,400 men had disappeared in an instant.
Aboard the Bismarck, the brief surge of triumph faded into an eerie, heavy silence. No one celebrated. That explosion, that impossible flash, that ship torn apart, was too overwhelming. There was no time to process the emotion, but it lingered in every stare, every clenched jaw. Even among the Germans, there was shock. Witnessing the death of a legend was something no one on that ocean would ever forget. The Prince of Wales, shaken to its core, attempted to continue the fight, but severe mechanical issues persisted. Systems jammed, guns malfunctioned, shots drifted off target. Still, the British pressed on, fighting through the grief and chaos, desperate to inflict damage. The Bismarck continued firing, but the battle was taking its toll. More enemy shells found their mark. The growing oil slick from the damaged bow was becoming impossible to hide. The crew struggled to minimize the leak, but the lost fuel already threatened the entire mission. Luton's decision was now unavoidable. The Bismarck's mission had to change. The goal was no longer to devastate British supply lines, it was to survive. As the Prince of Wales withdrew behind a screen of smoke, still firing to cover its retreat, the Atlantic seemed to hold its breath once more. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning. The sinking of the Hood would forever shape the fate of the Bismarck, and it would unleash a British response more furious than anyone aboard the German battleship could imagine.
The sea felt different after the brutal clash between giants. The Atlantic, once the stage of a titanic duel, now watched everything in somber silence, as if it understood the depth of the tragedy that had just taken place. The surface was littered with the remains of the Hood, splintered wood, twisted metal, slicks of oil, silent proof that only a few minutes had been enough to wipe out nearly an entire crew. Smoke still hung in the air, mingling with the cold morning fog, while the Prince of Wales slowly pulled away, spitting out sporadic rounds in a desperate attempt to keep the enemy at bay. Aboard the Bismarck, the mood was confusing. They had won, yet they had been wounded. The hit on the bow continued to bring a quiet pain to the ship, as if it were breathing unevenly. The trail of oil left behind was a clear sign that something was terribly wrong. Sailors rushed through corridors permeated by the sharp smell of fuel, trying to contain the leak, but they knew this was not a problem solved by strength or courage. It was pure engineering, and engineering under impossible conditions. Lindenman paced across the bridge, analyzing each report handed to him. His eyes showed complete focus, but beneath it, a shadow of concern lingered, one he could not hide even from himself. Admiral Lutyens remained silent, his expression rigid, perhaps still processing the emotional shock of the Hood's destruction. But there was no time for contemplation. The battle was over, and the most dangerous escape of the Bismarck's life had just begun. A message sent to Germany reported that the Hood had been destroyed. On the other side, initial euphoria erupted. But when the full report was transmitted, the ship's grave condition became equally clear. German high command responded with direct, almost uncomfortable orders. The Bismarck was to avoid further battles and reach occupied France as fast as possible. There, it would have access to safe docks and Luftwaffe air cover. But the crew knew the Atlantic offered no easy paths, especially while leaving behind an oil trail that betrayed their every move. The Prince Eugen was ordered to separate. It was a strange moment, almost lonely. The separation meant the Bismarck would continue alone, vulnerable, wounded, carrying the weight of the battle and the victory that now attracted every enemy on the ocean. As the cruiser faded slowly into the horizon, many aboard the Bismarck felt as though a part of their strength disappeared with it. From that moment on, the Royal Navy was not merely hunting a German warship, it was hunting the ship that sank the Hood. And that changed everything.
British ships scattered across the Atlantic received brief, non-negotiable orders. Find the Bismarck, no matter the cost, no matter how long it took. Destroying the Bismarck was not only a military priority, it was an emotional necessity, almost spiritual for the British. They needed to answer their loss with overwhelming force. As the Bismarck advanced with difficulty, British cruisers kept their distance, monitoring every move. They didn't get too close. They knew the battleship was still deadly, but they never lost sight of it. It was like watching a pack of predators circling a wounded giant, waiting for the right moment to strike. The psychological pressure on the Bismarck's crew grew heavier each hour. They knew they were being watched, followed, hunted. They knew every passing hour reduced their chance of escape. Engineers worked tirelessly, trying to save every drop of fuel. They calculated alternatives, possible routes, speed estimates, all while the ship slowly lost autonomy. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it could be cut with a knife. And then, just when a brief moment of calm suggested the British might be losing contact, the worst happened. A Catalina reconnaissance plane spotted the oil trail and transmitted the message that would turn the chase upside down. The Bismarck had been located, precisely. From that moment, one of the greatest naval pursuits in history began. The news spread through the British fleet like fire through fuel. Entire crews rushed to their stations. Radar operators fine-tuned their instruments. Signalmen updated coordinates. Warships shifted course in unison, forming a net of steel that slowly closed around the wounded giant. The Ark Royal launched aircraft to maintain visual contact. The Rodney surged forward at maximum speed, its massive hull smashing through the waves with brutal determination. The King George V adjusted course to intercept. Destroyers scattered across the region tried to predict possible German evasive maneuvers.
Meanwhile, aboard the Bismarck, the crew watched the horizon as if watching time itself collapse inward. Hours felt shorter, the ship felt slower, and the ocean felt larger and more hostile with every passing moment. The next morning brought dense fog, but no relief. Radar detected approaching British forces. Strange, distant sounds of aircraft engines began emerging. At first, a faint murmur, then a growing buzz. The bridge of the Bismarck fell into absolute silence for a few seconds. Every man there understood this was no reconnaissance. It was an attack. The Ark Royal had launched its Swordfish torpedo bombers. The sight of the biplanes emerging through the fog created a strange visual shock. They were old machines, fragile, slow, almost outdated relics. And yet, they carried the power to decide the fate of Germany's greatest battleship. The Bismarck's crew had only seconds to absorb this paradox before the alert sirens echoed through the ship. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire violently. The sky lit up with bright tracers, bursts of smoke, and flashes of exploding shells. The Swordfish planes dove and climbed with surprising agility, weaving through the barrage. It looked like a swarm of insects challenging a monster and somehow surviving. Torpedoes streaked across the water. The Bismarck maneuvered as best it could, but its reaction was delayed by accumulated damage. Waves rose in massive walls as the ship attempted to turn, but it was clear it no longer had full control. Then came the impact. Not the most powerful torpedo, not the fastest, but the most precise. It struck the rudder.
The explosion was deep, almost muffled, but devastating. The crew barely understood the damage in the first seconds, but it soon became unmistakable. The Bismarck began turning left on its own, automatically, no longer obeying the helm. Technicians in the steering compartment fought desperately to free the mechanism, but the damage was irreversible. It was as if the giant had lost the ability to walk. The Bismarck was condemned to circle. On the bridge, silence fell again. Reality hit every man with brutal force. They could no longer flee. They could no longer maneuver. They could no longer fight from a position of advantage. The fate of the ship had been sealed by a single torpedo launched from a biplane that in any other context would have been considered obsolete. From that moment on, the Bismarck was no longer navigating, it was drifting. And around it, British silhouettes began emerging one by one, like predators finally closing in on the prey they had been hunting for days. The final battle was coming, and the Bismarck knew it.
Dawn was approaching. But for the crew of the Bismarck, time no longer had meaning. There was no night or day, only an endless interval between hope and despair. The battleship continued, tracing involuntary arcs across the ocean, moving slowly, as if trapped in a tragic dance dictated by the invisible force of its destroyed rudder. Each turn was a cruel reminder that the most powerful ship Germany had ever built no longer commanded its own fate. Inside the hull, the atmosphere was suffocating, a mix of heat, noise, and tension. The engineers were still attempting the impossible, freeing the jammed rudder, improvising solutions, channeling mechanical force in ways the designers had never envisioned. But the truth was clear to anyone who had seen the damage. There was no coming back. That single hit had been decisive, fatal, final. Above them, the Atlantic was preparing the stage for the conclusion. The sky was heavy, clouds racing overhead, and the wind carried a near-funereal tone. In the distance, small dark shapes began to grow, British ships advancing like solid shadows. The first to approach was HMS Rodney, colossal, threatening, a floating fortress seemingly crafted for the sole purpose of destroying monsters like the Bismarck. Not far behind came King George V, advancing with quiet determination, like an executioner fulfilling an unavoidable sentence. And scattered around them, Cruisers and destroyers maintained their positions, tightening the encirclement with cold precision. The Bismarck's bridge remained silent as the enemy's silhouettes materialized. It was like watching mountains draw nearer. Men swallowed hard, clenched their hands, adjusted their uniforms. There was no panic. There was acceptance. They knew what was coming. They knew there would be no reinforcements, no air support, no miracles. The German Titan would face its last battle alone, like a condemned warrior who refuses to fall without fighting back. Captain Ernst Lindman adjusted his binoculars one final time. His eyes moved calmly across the British formation. He took a deep breath and, in a grave tone, said, "Prepare yourselves. We will fight to the end." At his side, Admiral Lutyens maintained his usual posture, rigid, disciplined, almost impenetrable. Many wondered what went on in his mind, but nothing on his face revealed fear, only conviction.
And then, before they could fully reposition their gun turrets, the sky erupted. The first shot came from Rodney, a massive, deep explosion that felt as though it split the air in two. The shell streaked across the sky like a meteor and landed close to the Bismarck, raising a column of water so enormous that for a moment it looked as though the German battleship would vanish beneath the wave. The second shot followed, then the third, then the fourth, and suddenly the entire ocean seemed to tremble. The Bismarck returned fire, but its salvos were inaccurate, slow, compromised. Each shot made the deck vibrate, but its aim, crippled by the locked rudder, could no longer track the enemy properly. The battleship fired like a blind fighter, swinging at opponents who moved fast and with calculated purpose. The first direct hits began pounding the superstructure. Shrapnel flew everywhere. Metal twisted, pipes were torn out, antennas shattered. Men were thrown against steel walls with brutal force. The smell of gunpowder, mixed with the scent of burning oil, seeped into every inch of the ship. Rodney, drawing closer and closer, began firing its massive 16-inch guns, each shot a quake, a thunderclap, a sentence. One shell struck the Bismarck's Bruno turret directly, blowing it apart in a fireball that illuminated the entire deck for several seconds. Another ripped through the command superstructure, sending electrical cables bursting like snakes of fire. The impacts were so intense that the floors trembled as though the ship were being hit by consecutive earthquakes. And still, the Bismarck did not sink. Even mutilated, burning, losing men and systems, the battleship remained standing, defying odds, defying logic, defying death itself. This fact impressed even the British. It was like fighting something that refused to collapse, a spirit unwilling to break. But the end was inevitable.
The anti-aircraft guns could no longer operate. The main turrets jammed. The rangefinders were destroyed. The superstructure was completely disfigured, as if the ship had had its face torn off. Inside the hull, fires multiplied, consuming entire compartments and chewing their way through corridors. In the center of the ship, officers began discussing the only remaining option, scuttling. They knew the British wanted to capture the hull, perhaps even tow it. That would be a humiliation the men of the Bismarck would never accept. If the ship had to fall, it would fall as a German warship, not as a British trophy. The order was given to open the scuttling valves. Men ran, some limping, some covered in soot and blood, to carry out the final command of the ship they had served with such pride. Slowly, almost with ritual dignity, the Bismarck began to sink. British gunfire diminished. Some of their sailors watched in silence, honoring the death of a giant. There were no cheers, no shouts, no celebration. Only the heavy weight of witnessing something monumental disappear. The bow of the Bismarck began to dip. The deck submerged deeper and deeper, as if the ship were exhaling one last breath of steel, one last deep groan from its internal structures as they collapsed under the weight of the water. Some men jumped into the freezing sea, fighting to survive. Others remained aboard, determined to accompany the ship to the end. And then, just before 11 a.m., the Bismarck disappeared beneath the waves. The sea closed over it in seconds, as if it were erasing a painting. The giant had fallen, and with it fell the myth of German invincibility in the Atlantic. But its story was only just beginning.
When the Bismarck slipped beneath the waves, the ocean closed over it so quickly that it seemed eager to end the story. Within seconds, the surface was still again, except for the widening circle of oil that reflected the gray sky like a shattered mirror. But while the sea tried to erase what had happened, the impact of the sinking was already spreading across the world like an electric shock. Aboard the British ship surrounding the site, a heavy silence dominated. The guns were quiet. The engines slowed. Men walked the decks with slow, contemplative steps, staring at the empty space where the giant had fought until its final breath. None of them celebrated. There was no room for celebration. Before them, fragments of wood, twisted metal, and streaks of fuel floated like tragic echoes of a battle that had ended, yet left an irreversible scar. Rescue operations began immediately. Ropes were thrown into the sea. Boats were lowered despite the rough waves. The British knew every minute cost lives. But the North Atlantic had no mercy. The freezing waters drained body heat and consciousness within minutes. Many of the men who had escaped the Bismarck were already unconscious when pulled aboard. Many more would not make it in time. The survivors, wrapped in blankets and trembling violently, struggled to understand how they were still alive. Some cried quietly. Others stared into nothingness, their minds still trapped somewhere on the shattered deck of the ship. Some were burned, others were cut by shrapnel. Some had hands so stiff from the cold they could barely grip the mug of hot tea that British sailors offered them. Despite the war raging around them, in that moment there were no sides, only human beings trying to save other human beings. British sailors spoke to the Germans with reserved but unmistakable respect. A young British officer later wrote in his diary, "They fought like lions. It was impossible not to feel respect." Meanwhile, across the continent, the news raced through Britain. In London, radio broadcasts were interrupted. Emergency headlines appeared. Bismarck destroyed. The feeling that washed over the country was a mixture of relief and sorrow. The ghost of the Hood had finally been avenged, yet the emotional and human cost of the operation weighed heavily on the national conscience. Many knew this victory would not end the war, but it would reshape its history.
In Germany, the news struck like a hammer. Nazi propaganda attempted to control the narrative with vague statements that avoided admitting the scale of the defeat. But nothing could be concealed for long. Letters stopped arriving. Messages went unanswered. Entire families waited for news that would never come. Hitler was enraged, not only at the loss of the ship, but at the symbolic blow it represented. The Bismarck had been his showcase, his promise of naval supremacy. The vessel meant to humiliate England. Now it had become a monument to the failure of that ambition. Within the high command, fear spread. Some officers believed the Führer would blame individuals personally, beginning purges that would only deepen the chaos already consuming the German Navy. For many German families, the grief began there. In the days and weeks that followed, telegrams arrived reporting the deaths of sons, brothers, fathers. The messages were short, bureaucratic, incapable of conveying the reality of men who died surrounded by steel and fire in the middle of an unforgiving ocean. In quiet homes, mothers held medals sent as consolation. Wives clutched photographs that felt more alive than their memories. Children asked when their fathers would return, and no one had the courage to answer. As emotions spread across Europe, the Atlantic moved on indifferently. Thousands of meters below the surface, the Bismarck drifted downward until it touched the ocean floor. During its descent, parts of the hull broke away.
turrets detached, fragments scattered through the deep like breadcrumbs from a dying giant. And then it came to rest, silent, frozen, eternal. But even in death, the Bismarck remained a topic of fascination.
The survivors, few, traumatized, exhausted, were interrogated by the British, not harshly, but thoroughly. They wanted to understand what had happened in the final minutes, whether the scuttling had truly been ordered. They wanted to reconstruct every step of the battle. And the accounts were astonishing. Men described entire corridors collapsing, the radio room destroyed in seconds, the deck shaking with every impact until it felt the ship would rip apart. Smoke so dense some could barely see their own hands. Heat from flames scorching skin from meters away. They spoke of a final collective effort, wounded men, some nearly blinded by smoke, manually opening the scuttling valves, others destroying sensitive documents, some gathering in corners, resigned, waiting for the end, others praying loudly, searching for one last spark of peace amid absolute chaos. The British listened with attention and respect. Many officers later wrote that they would never forget the dignity and courage of those men, even though they had been enemies hours earlier. As days passed, British newspapers began publishing the first detailed analyses of the battle. Diagrams, damage explanations, reconstructions of the engagement. The public became fascinated. It felt as though they were witnessing a mythological duel, so grand, so tragic, that it transcended the reality of war. And slowly, a transformation began. The Bismarck was no longer just a ship. It was becoming memory. And memory, inevitably, was becoming legend. It was impossible to stop. Ordinary ships vanish. Extraordinary ships remain. And the Bismarck, even at the bottom of the sea, was only beginning its journey into history.
The weeks that followed the sinking of the Bismarck didn't diminish the intensity of what had happened. If anything, they amplified it. The ship, now lost to the deep, began to take on almost mythical proportions in the public imagination. Newspapers continued publishing analyses, testimonies, diagrams, and speculation. People wanted answers. They wanted to understand how a ship that seemed invincible had been destroyed in such a short span of time, and why its fall echoed so profoundly even among those who had never seen the sea. The British government treated the episode as a strategic victory, but avoided turning it into a spectacle. There was something unsettling about celebrating the deaths of thousands of men, even if they were enemies. Official speeches highlighted the professionalism of the Royal Navy and the military necessity of the operation. Yet outside political circles, public sentiment was far more layered. Many saw the Bismarck as an enemy, yes, but also as a worthy opponent, an extraordinary machine that had dared to challenge the world's most traditional navy. In Germany, the narrative took a different turn. Nazi propaganda tried to transform the Bismarck into a symbol of heroism, using grand phrases and stylized images of the ship slicing through stormy seas. But far from posters and broadcasts, the population felt the loss in a much more intimate way. Families of the sailors who had served aboard the battleship received telegrams, cold, vague, bureaucratic messages, informing them that their loved ones had died in combat for the Reich, and each slip of paper carried with it a universe of pain. In small coastal towns where many crew members had grown up, churches filled with silent vigils. Older men, veterans of previous wars, whispered among themselves that no ship so large could ever exist without attracting tragedy of equal scale. Women held photographs and medals, some still unable to believe the news, and many young people who had seen in the Bismarck a symbol of national pride now wondered what else might collapse.
Meanwhile, within Germany's military circles, tension grew steadily. The sinking of the Bismarck had exposed weaknesses in communication, rushed decision-making, and tactical miscalculations that the Kriegsmarine struggled to hide. Some officers feared even more the reaction of the High Command, especially Hitler, whose rage had become unpredictable. The Bismarck had not only been defeated, it had revealed vulnerabilities the regime could no longer deny.
But while governments, families, and officers processed the loss, something curious was happening internationally. The Bismarck was already being discussed as a historical phenomenon. Naval historians emphasized that the battleship represented the peak of the battleship era, an era already being overshadowed by aircraft carriers and torpedo bombers. Engineers were fascinated by the technical details of the ship, its innovative armor layout, its efficient internal compartments, its unmatched power. And within British naval circles, detailed studies began re-examining every stage of the hunt, reconstructing scenarios, analyzing mistakes, and documenting successes. The truth was that the Bismarck had become something rare, a story that captured both the terror of war and the tragic beauty of human engineering. It was a symbol of strength, yet also of fragility, and that contrast was irresistible to anyone trying to understand what truly defines naval warfare. As the years passed, the ship evolved from fact into metaphor. In naval conferences, its name appeared as a warning of how inadequate command could compromise superior technology. In engineering schools, its structure was studied as an example of both advancement and limitation in 20th century metallurgy. In books, films, and radio broadcasts, the Bismarck alternated between monster, victim, masterpiece, and moral lesson. And then there were those who longed to see it again. The Atlantic, with its dark, unpredictable waters, was considered at the time an impenetrable guardian. The depth at which the Bismarck rested was thought nearly unreachable, and many believed the wreck would never be found. To some, this felt appropriate. A ship so grand deserved a secret tomb, hidden in the vast, silent wilderness of the ocean. To others, it was frustrating to think that so many answers remained untouched, unreachable.
But while the tomb seemed inaccessible, the imagination of humankind had never been more open. The Bismarck had become part of maritime myth, a rare kind of event that, instead of losing strength with time, gained it. Its fall was debated in universities and in crowded bars, by veterans and by teenagers fascinated with war stories. It was as if, by vanishing beneath the waves, the ship had found a new way to exist in people's minds. And nothing suggested that this fascination would fade, because the Bismarck, even destroyed, had left behind something indestructible, the sense that it had witnessed a decisive chapter of the 20th century. And as its story continued being told, debated, and reinterpreted, a single question began to take shape in the shadows, a question that would eventually guide new expeditions, new searches, new revelations. If the Bismarck became legend on the surface, what exactly remained of it in the depths? The answer would come years later, but the desire to find it had already been ignited.
As the decades passed, the Bismarck ceased to be merely a military event and gradually transformed into a kind of psychological and historical frontier. Something about its story unsettled scholars, sailors, and enthusiasts alike. The narrative was incomplete. People knew how the ship had been defeated, approximately where it had vanished, and what political and strategic impact its destruction had caused. But no one knew how it truly rested on the ocean floor, what condition its structure was in, or what scars the final battle had left upon its steel. It was like reading an epic without ever reaching its final, definitive chapter.
And it was this incompleteness that began to move entire generations. By the late 1960s, as ocean navigation and seafloor mapping technologies advanced, the first concrete ideas for locating the Bismarck began to emerge. These early proposals were cautious, almost experimental, formulated by visionary oceanographers and curious financiers, many of whom were fascinated not by the war itself, but by the immensity of the mystery. Yet the North Atlantic remained a fortress, vast, frigid, turbulent, and brutally deep. Even so, no one gave up. Through the 1970s, oceanographic tools became bolder. Side-scan sonar systems could now probe larger sections of the seabed. Unmanned submersibles began reaching depths once thought unreachable. And as science advanced, dreams slowly drifted into the realm of the possible. By then, the Bismarck had become a recurring subject in naval journals, military history conferences, and European radio programs. Every new theory about its location triggered heated discussions. Some insisted the ship was shattered beyond recognition. Others believed its German armor would have preserved it remarkably well. And some even speculated that the battleship had broken into multiple sections as it hit the seafloor. But these were still only hypotheses, nothing more. It wasn't until the 1980s that the world realized the mystery was finally about to be illuminated. At the center of this new chapter stood Robert Ballard, the American oceanographer who would become world famous for exploring near-mythic shipwrecks. After locating the Titanic, Ballard turned his attention to the Bismarck, but his motives went far beyond simple technical curiosity. He wanted to understand through the ship's remains how the final battle had truly unfolded. He sought objective answers to questions that had fueled speculation for decades.
The expedition began the way great modern journeys often do, with caution, meticulous planning, and quiet anticipation. But the ocean seemed determined to oppose them. Weather shifted violently, towering waves threatened delicate equipment, and each day carried immense costs. Still, the team persisted. There was a shared sense that they stood on the edge of something monumental. When the sonar finally revealed the first metallic echoes more than 4,000 meters below the surface, nobody breathed for several long seconds. The screen displayed strange geometric forms, dense shapes, shadows that did not belong to natural seafloor geology. The images were distorted, but they had a pattern, a human pattern. The confirmation came hours later. As the robotic submersible descended slowly into the abyss, sweeping the darkness with narrow beams of artificial light, a silhouette began to materialize, enormous, angular, unmistakable. It was like watching a ghost take physical form. The Bismarck was there, not as an unrecognizable wreck, but as a colossal figure asleep in the deep. The explorers fell into absolute silence, a silence that was not scientific, but profoundly human. Because before them lay a machine that had shaped destinies, carried men, provoked debate, and fed legends. And there it was, motionless, quiet, draped in sediment. The first details revealed more than any book ever could. The bow, surprisingly intact, looked as though it could still cut through waves. The hull, though heavily damaged, retained its iconic shape. The mutilated gun turrets still sat in place, as if waiting for orders that would never come again. But destruction was everywhere. Armor plates torn away, massive holes punched by British shells, internal structures exposed like bones under torn skin. One could clearly see where fire had consumed entire compartments, where explosions had folded steel like paper. And perhaps most revealing of all,
where the German crew had unmistakably initiated the scuttling process.
The images circled the world. For many, it felt like reopening an old wound. For others, it was a moment of absolute fascination. And for the surviving crew, now elderly, it became a kind of reunion with a part of their lives they never imagined returning to. Some cried quietly, recognizing sections of the ship where they had worked, fought, lived. Others stared in silence, as if watching the past finally settle into its rightful place. More than revealing how the ship sank, the discovery reignited the emotional question: why did the Bismarck still matter so deeply? The answer did not come from engineering or strategy, but from human nature. The ship symbolized something immense, the story of an entire era condensed into a single artifact, the fall of an empire, the limits of technology, the tragedy of war, the pride and grief of thousands of families. To see the Bismarck again was to see the 20th century reflected in the depths, and as explorers continued mapping its hull, the world realized something unexpected. The ship was not merely a monument to the past, but a living reminder of the eternal need to understand what war truly means. The Bismarck lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, but its story, more than ever, remained on the surface.
With the definitive discovery of the Bismarck, a new wave of global interest took shape, deeper, more emotional, and, in a sense, more philosophical. For now, it was no longer a matter of imagining what remained of the ship, but of seeing it with one's own eyes, of confronting in the depths of the Atlantic not just a historical artifact, but the silent body of an entire era. Museums began reconstructing scale models based on the real footage, correcting details that had once been mere speculation. Historians revisited old debates with renewed arguments. The public, fascinated, filled auditoriums to attend lectures about the battleship that had barely lived a week in active service, yet remained eternally alive in the collective memory. The question that always resurfaced, why had the Bismarck become as monumental in meaning as it had been in size, was now being explored in ways far beyond technical facts. It was not merely the military drama, nor the destructive power, nor the epic hunt. It was something deeper, almost mythological. In a sense, the Bismarck personified the 20th century itself, ambitious, proud, technologically advanced, yet vulnerable, contradictory, and destined to collapse under its own weight. Its birth symbolized power, its journey, expectation, its fall, disillusionment, and its silence on the ocean floor, reflection. This symbolism made it essential study material for anyone interested in politics, engineering, warfare, ethics, or historical memory. As the years passed, academic institutions organized full events dedicated to the ship. Researchers compared its trajectory to other iconic machines of war. They discussed its role as a propaganda symbol, its psychological impact on naval warfare, its function as a catalyst for strategic transformation. And the more they studied it, the clearer it became that the Bismarck was, above all, a warning cast in steel. Meanwhile, new expeditions returned to the wreck site, not seeking artifacts or treasure, but understanding. Modern equipment revealed extraordinary details: collapsed cabins, twisted corridors, intact portholes, combat scars preserved like wounds frozen in time. Some areas appeared untouched, suspended in history. Others bore the unmistakable marks of the ocean's slow, inevitable erosion. The contrast was striking. The ship that had once inspired fear now inspired respect.
At the same time, the public incorporated the Bismarck into culture in unexpected ways. Its name appeared in songs, novels, digital games, television series. For many young people, this was their first contact with naval history of the Second World War. They saw the battleship as a tragic titan, a figure almost literary in nature. And naturally, this reignited curiosity about the men who had served aboard. Biographies of officers and sailors gained new readership. Newspapers rediscovered letters written by crew members before departure. Some were optimistic, others melancholic, others filled with youthful ambition. Reading such fragments was like hearing voices rising from the ocean floor, voices reminding the world that the Bismarck was not only steel, but also flesh, hope, and fear. At veterans' gatherings, the ship was remembered with a kind of sacred reverence. They did not glorify the ideology behind it, but the humanity of those who had lived and fought within its hull. Some survivors attended smiling. Others remained quiet, as though carrying memories too heavy to ever fully express. Over time, the Bismarck began to occupy a space similar to that of ancient ruins or monumental natural formations. Not merely an object of study, but one of contemplation, a symbol no one could ignore. Every generation saw something different in it, a lesson, a mistake, a marvel, a tragedy. Yet the feeling persisted that something always remained out of reach. No matter how many documentaries were produced, how many books were written, how many underwater images were analyzed, the Bismarck always held on to a mystery, not a technical one, but an existential one. It was the question that echoed among historians, sailors, and thinkers. Why did this ship, among so many destroyed in the Second World War, become eternal? The answer was in its story, but also in us.
Because the Bismarck was a mirror, reflecting human power and frailty, reflecting the desire for greatness and the consequences that follow, reflecting the illusion of invincibility and the inevitability of downfall, reflecting humanity's ability to build something extraordinary and destroy it just as completely. And above all, reflecting our need to search for meaning, even in the most overwhelming tragedies. That is why, when approaching the footage of that hull lying on the ocean floor, many described feeling a chill, not only from the darkness of the environment, but from the realization that every great story of war is, first and foremost, a story of humanity lost. The Bismarck remained below, motionless, silent, separated from the world. But above the waves, its narrative continued to expand, crossing decades, touching former enemies alike, uniting people who would never meet. Because in the end, the ship had ceased to be a weapon and had become memory. And memories, when they are vast enough, do not belong to the ocean. They belong to time. As the decades passed, the Bismarck ceased to be merely a chapter of the Second World War and began occupying an almost ritualistic place in the human imagination. Its name sparked debates, inspiration, fear, and reflection that went far beyond the naval sphere. It was as though the more time that passed since its sinking, the more its story gained density, weight, and meaning. And this transformation, silent, inevitable, proved that some machines do not disappear when they sink. They simply change form. In the years following the ship's discovery, the images of its hull resting in the abyss became a fundamental part of how the world perceived it. There, in absolute silence, the Bismarck seemed to stare back at whoever observed it, not with threat, but with a kind of solemn sadness. It was proof that even the pinnacle of human engineering meets its limits. Proof that no arsenal, no matter how grand, can dominate fate when fate decides to act. Researchers returned to the site countless times, always with the same reverence. Each dive brought new readings, new discoveries, new questions. There were marks of internal explosions confirming the scuttling. There were also massive wounds inflicted by British bombardment. The truth, complex and multifaceted, showed that the Bismarck had not been defeated by any single factor, but by a tragic convergence of human and mechanical circumstances, one that sealed its fate with implacable precision. For many, this detail was crucial. The Bismarck had not fallen simply because it was caught. It fell because it was human, because flaws, decisions, risks, and uncertainties are inherent to anything created by human hands. And this realization, so distant from the strategic analyses of earlier decades, transformed the ship into a metaphor for far more than war. Thus, as scientific expeditions advanced and improved imaging technologies revealed layers once invisible, the Bismarck story began connecting with something much larger – humanity's need to revisit its past in order to understand its own contradictions. Historians began debating not just what happened, but why it happened. Why was the ship sent on such a risky mission? Why risk such a powerful symbol so early in the war? Why were crucial decisions made under extreme pressure? And why, despite such advanced engineering, could a single vulnerability in the rudder determine the fate of thousands? These questions echoed through classrooms, conferences, museums, and discussion tables, creating a kind of historical spiral, a continuous movement between past and present. And the more the topic was explored, the clearer it became that the Bismarck offered something rare, a mirror capable of reflecting both human pride and its fundamental flaws.
At the same time, the general public embraced the ship as a character. Films, books, songs, and digital portrayals reinforced its image as the protagonist of a tragic epic, a hero and a villain at once, a machine inspiring both admiration and dread. The ship came to symbolize the apex of the battleship era and, paradoxically, the moment of its decline. After the Bismarck, it became clear that the naval world was changing, that battleships would no longer dictate the outcomes of wars, that the air, not steel, would shape the future. This duality gave the ship a unique aura. It represented both the height and the fall of the same era. Moreover, the presence of the wreck deep beneath the ocean granted the Bismarck a special kind of eternity. It was not exposed to the time of the surface, to political conflicts, to the world's sudden transformations. It was protected by silence and darkness, guarded by a natural barrier that kept its memory intact. Every dive to the wreck felt like visiting an underwater temple, a memorial crafted not by human hands but by nature itself. And it was impossible to look upon the dormant hull without feeling something profound, visceral. The sight of the ship, so immense and yet so fragile, reminded all who watched that it was not merely steel. It was the physical imprint of interrupted lives, crushed dreams, and irreversible decisions. A stark reminder that technology and power do not make anyone invincible, only expand the scale of consequences. With time, it became increasingly common to hear experts say that the Bismarck's true importance did not lie in its battle, but in its memory. It was studied not only by military scholars, but by psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and artists. The ship inspired reflections on heroism, propaganda, destiny, sacrifice, and the price of power. It was examined not for its perfection, but for its fallibility, not for its victories, but for its collapse. And gradually, an undeniable truth emerged. The Bismarck endured because it expressed something essential about us. In its brief operational life, it represented a nation's ultimate attempt to project strength. In its sudden fall, it represented the brutality of war and the fragility of human ambition. In its eternal silence beneath the sea, it represented the reminder that no myth remains immune to time, though some do become part of it. And so, at the end of this journey, the Bismarck remains not as a ship, but as a story that transcends steel, sea, and war.
A story that continues to be told by those who seek to understand how the past shapes the present. A story that still moves, inspires, and haunts. Because some machines are more than machines. Some shipwrecks are more than defeats. Some echoes are too powerful to disappear. The Bismarck was born, lived, and died in the 20th century, but belongs to every century that comes after. And as long as someone studies it, questions it, remembers it, or simply marvels at its silent presence at the bottom of the Atlantic, the Bismarck will remain alive. Thus this narrative ends not with the ship's fall, but with the understanding that certain stories cannot sink. They stay, always.